part two of our tribute to Doug DeMuro. You can call it a blatant ripoff, yes. We're copying two videos from Doug DeMuro, two really good ideas, right? The first one has already aired on the channel. Go check it out. The 10 most transformative cars for the Brazilian automotive industry in the last 30 years. Now comes the interesting part, the criticism, because in Brazil's automotive internet scene, you have to be tough or people think you're paid by car makers. And look, if you like seeing people criticizing the car manufacturers, you're going to love this because there's criticism for almost all of them here. I organized it by manufacturer. So sometimes if a manufacturer has more than one mistake, it's listed here in the top 10. They're stacking mistake on top of mistake. So look, everyone is going to get their share here. And that's what drives engagement in the algorithm. So let's get started. Also, this is kind of in chronological order, but it's not in order of the size of the mistake or anything like that. It really just came to me as I was thinking about it. The first one, which doesn't really fit into the time frame I chose, since I was mostly focusing on the third millennium, but it's one of the biggest mistakes in the history of the Brazilian automotive industry, which is the ill-fated Autolatina, the bizarre marriage between Volkswagen and Ford in Brazil, which we can understand perfectly. If you're younger, if you're not 44 like I am, you didn't live through Brazil in the 80s. It was a situation of absurd precariousness, stagflation as we call it. The country had a lot of inflation, but there was no economic growth. And the car manufacturers had to do whatever it took to survive. And the biggest car manufacturer in Germany and the second biggest car manufacturer in the United States looked at Brazil like this. Hey, what if we teamed up there? That ended up producing almost no remarkable products, right? I think one good thing from Autolatina was the AP 2.0 engine saving the Escort XR3. The engine, first as a 1.8 and then as a 2.0, transformed the Escort XR3, which was a project from Ford Europe but didn't have engines up to the task in Brazil. So it really put the XR3 in the fight with sports cars like the Gol GTI and Cadet GSI. And look, I'm already having to move over here to think about other cool legacies from Autolatina, which did give birth to a lot of weird stuff. Things like the Volkswagen Apollo, which was just a rebadged Verona. Things like the Royale wagon, the Versailles wagon, being forced at first to only exist as a two-door so it wouldn't compete with the Quantum, which was the Santana wagon and had the exclusive rights to four doors within the Autolatina universe. And in the end, that was very harmful for Ford. The numbers are like this. Ford entered Autolatina with almost 20% market share in Brazil. It had about 17-18% share and left with 10. Autolatina really eroded the brand image and product portfolio, especially for Ford in Brazil. But on the other hand, it allowed Ford to continue operating and manufacturing in Brazil. During that period then, maybe it was the lesser of two evils, but it led to a series of not very memorable products. Yes, it did. Number two, look, even the premium brands are going to get it here, right? Mercedes A-Class and the factory there in Juiz de Fora. Although people from Juiz de Fora don't talk like that, right? The dream of someone from Juiz de Fora is to be from Rio. So the accent is different. But why is it such a clear mistake, right? When we look back, Mercedes only manufactured there for 6 years, right? It was 6 to 7, let's say. It was from 99 to 2005. Imagine making all that investment in a factory for it to last only about 6 years. It was 60,000 units, right? 60,000 and a few units of the A-Class made there. So about 10,000 cars per year. It was a car that was created precisely to be a high-volume car, right? I remember the ad campaign very well. You in a Mercedes, right? And it was a product that didn't please anyone, basically, right? A lot of people bought it for the status of having their first Mercedes, but it was a much more expensive car than its main competitors, right? It was positioned against the top versions of mid-size hatchbacks here in Brazil, right? Cars like the Golf Bravo at the time, right? But it offered less and cost more, and it didn't have the engine option started only with a 1.6, then a 1.9 came later. So it still came out as kind of an underpowered car with a controversial design, and it had the problems with the Moose test. But all of that is a development problem with the global A-Class, right? With the product itself, not really a matter of strategy in Brazil. Why do I say it was a huge mistake? Because Mercedes closed the Juiz de Fora factory, right? And then, about 10 years later, maybe even less, BMW comes in with the Araquari factory, And thanks to that factory, thanks to believing in that business model from the Innovar Auto program at the time, BMW has been flying high, dominating in Brazil for many years as the leader in the premium market segment, right? Producing a lot of the 3 Series and X1 models that have very interesting volumes for premium cars in Brazil. For many years now, BMW has been selling twice as much or more than Mercedes in Brazil. That's something that usually doesn't happen in any major global market, right? BMW has such a bigger scale than Mercedes. So what if Mercedes had held its ground there? If they had believed in the Juiz de Fora factory, or at least hadn't been traumatized by the Juiz de Fora factory, and if they had thought about a local factory back in the 2000s or 2010s to make, I don't know, the C-Class and GLA, they could have been much more competitive with BMW over the years. If we look at how many more cars BMW sold in Brazil since the opening of the Araquari factory compared to Mercedes, it's tens of thousands more. That's billions of dollars in revenue that Mercedes missed out on in Brazil. Did they miss out on putting that in their pocket? Our third point here is something where we have two sides of the coin, right? One is the extreme agility of Fiat, later FCA, and now Stellantis, with their Brazilian operation being able to spot trends and create products that are really dedicated to the Brazilian market. And we often contrast this with the lethargy of Volkswagen, right, which has a lot of bureaucracy, much more bureaucracy with Germany. Compared to Fiat's relationship with Italy, to quickly respond to the desires and trends of the Brazilian consumer, right? And in Volkswagen's case, we have two big symbols, right, of this slowness to act sometimes. One is precisely the reaction to Fiat's adventure line, right, which was there with Palio Adventure, Strada Adventure, Doblo Adventure booming at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s. And man, how is a Volkswagen employee from Brazil going to knock on the door in Germany and explain to the German engineer, look, we want to do the following. We want to throw another 100 kilos of plastic on the car and charge more for it. Fuel consumption, emissions, and performance will all worsen, but that's what people want. And the German engineer says, no, they're crazy. That's forbidden. And Fiat kept selling the adventure, right? Because it was a, I'm not here. This thing that makes the automotive internet so disgusting. Brazilians aren't stupid for accepting it. They're just poor. Brazil ranks 80th in per capita income. What did the Brazilian buying the Palio Adventure want? A Land Rover, right? He wanted a Ford Explorer, right? SUVs were booming in the United States. They were the big trend in the mid-90s. Here in Brazil, we had the Ford Runner, right? Hilux SW4 in Brazil. But in the 90s, there was that SUV wave in the United States with the Explorer, with the Nissan Pathfinder, with the Toyota 4Runner. They were cars that were very, even the Chevrolet Blazer, right? Cars that were a big hit in the United States became very aspirational, right? People didn't want the minivan anymore, the mom car, right? The soccer mom's car. I want an adventurous car, one that shows the world how I go hang gliding, go rafting with my canoe, do my mountain bike races. Me, a very adventurous guy. Only 1% of buyers actually did that, but that's the message you showed the world, right? In Brazil, with a per capita income then of about $6,000 or $7,000 a year, now 10,000, you could only do so much. Hey, lift up that Palio weekend there and make it look really tough, and it's going to sell the same vibe for a fraction of the price. And Fiat really nailed it with the adventure and dominated the market alone. Volkswagen only responded much later with the CrossFox, which didn't have the same vibe, right? It was a smaller car. They hung that spare tire on the back to kind of make it look the part. Look, it didn't work. The CrossFox wasn't a spacious car, right? For someone who really has an active lifestyle, an SUV needs to have space for my surfboard, for my kayak, for my bike, and the CrossFox didn't have that space. So Volkswagen was never able to give a proper answer. And the same thing happens with SUVs, right? Ford started this with the EcoSport, then Renault followed with the Duster. The Adventure line itself is how Fiat managed to respond quickly to this. They didn't have an SUV in their global lineup, and developing something quickly here in Brazil would have been very expensive. So, boom, just raise it up. The Palio Adventure was a large, spacious car and a direct competitor to the EcoSport. Volkswagen didn't have a competitor like that and would only get an SUV. Wow. Only with the T-Cross, after years of the Renegade, HR-V, and several other competitors' SUVs selling like crazy in Brazil, even the second generation of the EcoSport had already arrived. and only then did Volkswagen have an answer to the SUV market. Look, if I'm not mistaken, the T-Cross came out in 2018 and the EcoSport in 2003, right? It took Volkswagen 15 years to convince headquarters, hey, we need an SUV here, guys. Fourth on our list. In the previous video, I listed Logan and Sandero as transformative cars, right? Among the 10 most transformative in the Brazilian industry. But that goes both ways, right? Renault also allowed itself within a very difficult economic context in Brazil from around 2015 onwards, right? In the 2010s, but from 2015 onwards, when everyone really pulled back, right? The manufacturing plants, the installed capacity was really high, and that caused a lot of anxiety. How am I going to manage to keep up the volume here without having to shut this down, right? And not let this operation bleed money? And Renault was like, man, we're going to have to go ultra low cost, right? Let's take the Dacia line, put a diamond badge on the front, and call it Renault. And that kept Renault alive in Brazil, right? Like I said in the previous video, it has its pros and cons, but it completely eroded the brand, right? Renault managed to maintain respectable volumes with the Kwid, the Sandero, the Logan, and the Duster. But now we can see this transformation, right? This so-called Renaulution, right? Renault's Renaulution strategy. Now Renault wants to sell the Boreal, wants to sell the Koleos. It's going to be tough, right? Especially nowadays, right? I thought the Koleos Esprit Alpine, which is coming now, looked really nice. But when you get to the showroom, right? That showroom, and not just the showroom, right? The sales force, the after sales training, everything has been focused for years on much simpler cars with much less added value, right? So I think Renault should have found a way to sustain itself. Yes, let's put the low margin, low cost products here, the low cost products, so we can keep up the volume to keep the factory running. But let's also keep one foot in the premium segment. Let's do it, even if it's just importing 1,000 Renault Espace per year, 1,000 Renault Megane per year, just so the brand image doesn't erode that much. And Renault didn't do that, and the brand image eroded a lot. And that's one of the big challenges the brand has in Brazil today, to go back to selling higher value added products, products with more added value again. The fifth is Ford with the EcoSport, right? They scored a great goal with the arrival of the EcoSport in 2003. The new generation as well, although it already has some flaws, right? It lost that rugged SUV look that had been one of the main reasons for the EcoSport's success. It ends up with a much more slanted windshield, kind of like a minivan. But even so, it remains competitive in the segment, selling in decent volumes. And then it dries up, right? Ford actually opened up this niche, and then when the niche really started to heat up, which was around 2015 with the arrival of the Renegade and the first generation of the HR-V, and the SUVs with much higher margins start selling around 60 to 70,000 units per year. Ford lacked a competitive product. They missed that wave, and of course we know why, right? Because the whole operation, right? That same squeeze that turned Renault in Brazil into a Dacia was leaving Ford without a clear plan for what it was going to do in Brazil. They would have had to invest a lot to renew their three high-volume models here, which were the Ka Sedan, and EcoSport. The market wasn't showing any signs, that this would be profitable, that it would be viable. And then another mistake here, like I said, when the same automaker makes more than one mistake, we put it on the table. The way Ford communicated what in practice was the end of local production of the Ka and EcoSport, the closing of the São Bernardo factory and stopping the production of the Ka and EcoSport. But the way it was done, and that's just a feeling, I think there was still a lot of internal debate about what to do. And when the side that chose to end production finally won, bam, the announcement was made kind of in a kind of rushed way, right? And the message that stuck was Ford left Brazil, when that's not the case. Actually, the message was Ford is repositioning itself in Brazil. Ford will continue to have thousands of employees in Brazil, a large office, a research and development center in Bahia, a large product portfolio as well, but with higher value products. We are going to become the largest importer of premium cars in Brazil. That's what Ford is today, right? Ford has volumes of around 40,000 units per year in Brazil without manufacturing any cars in Brazil, right? No one imports and sells as many cars in Brazil as Ford. That's it. And today, all the cars are critically acclaimed, right? When you talk about Maverick, Bronco, Mustang, Territory, Ranger, right? Products that our market has always coveted and never had, like the Ranger Raptor itself and now the Mustang Dark Horse. So A message that had a lot of positive things ended up getting spun into something very negative, right? So it's not even, I wouldn't call it a mistake here. The end of production for the Kai and EcoSport, which in fact were products that were already old and would require a lot of investment to remain viable in the Brazilian market. But yes, the way this was communicated. But we know, right? The automotive industry is made, there's no single entity called Ford. It's made up of many people. Every brand consists of different people and departments. Sometimes, right, there are internal debates, and I think the way this internal debate ended up being concluded and thrown out very quickly was negative, you know? Troller itself, right, which was something that was never really a big business in itself, right? Manufacturing and selling troller in Brazil. It was a good business. It was a big deal for Ford because of the tax exemptions tied to the factory there in Ceará. So, yeah, it seems like it was kind of forgotten in this process. Oh, Ford killed Troller, right? As if Troller was some great national treasure, something that sold tens of thousands a year. It was a super niche brand, right? We've had so many national niche brands, but it also ended up costing, right? Today, we can say that Ford Brazil has already completely recovered from the impact that this crisis brought, right? Ford Brazil's recovery, for example, is built on very good products like the Ranger, right? They've never sold as many Rangers as they do nowadays, for example. The Ranger, which has always come from Argentina. Well, not always, right? Since 1998, it's been coming from Argentina. It was never manufactured in Brazil, right? But it did cause quite a headache for the Blue Oval folks for a good while. It really did. Number 6. And this one, look, this one is controversial. I'm going to have to call it the Barba era from Chevrolet. Carlos Barba, a Mexican designer who is a guy with an impressive resume. He worked for years at Opel in Germany, then came here to the Latin American operations and Mercosur, right, from Chevrolet. And I'm also being unfair to Barba, right? Because he was also part of a moment at Chevrolet, which is this moment of Renault's Dacification in Brazil, which is also when Ford decided to downsize its operations in Brazil and focus on higher value-added imported products. Chevrolet, what did they do, right? While Renault already had Dacia's portfolio ready, Chevrolet had to invest and create a portfolio of products for emerging markets, especially Brazil, right? But they were also exported to Latin America, and some things were made in partnership with Asian markets as well. But it was up to Carlos Barba to design several cars that were responsible for replacing European Opels that were far more sophisticated, right? So Barba had to make an Agile to replace a European Corsa, a Montana to replace a Montana based on the European Corsa, and a Spin to replace a Zafira based on a European project. The Cobalt, right, which in a way will, it's a new segment, right, kind of created by the Logan, but it becomes the only sedan of the, well, not the only one, right? Then comes the Cruise, so it would be the replacement for the European Corsa sedan, right? The Cobalt. Yeah, so man, all the products were downgraded during project refinement, right? The guy couldn't work miracles. That said, they didn't need to put those huge headlights on the front of all of them, right? In fact, the Spin, Cobalt, Agile, all of them later got facelifts done by Barba himself, which really improved the look of the cars, right? If he had done in the first round, you know, at the launch, what he later did in the facelift, maybe he wouldn't be on this list now, right? But maybe we also wouldn't have great nicknames like the Capybara Spin, the Monstrana, the Fragile, and so on. Yeah, number 7. Look, it would require another video because it's so complex, but basically I'll sum it up as Hyundai from Korea not reading the fine print in contracts here in Brazil, right? When Hyundai licensed the brand to the Kawa group back in the 90s, I think it was when hardly anyone had much faith in Korea or thought Brazil would become or could become such an important market for Hyundai. They gave the exclusive rights to produce Hyundai vehicles in Brazil to the Kawa group, which built the Anápolis factory where they made the Tucson and other models. So when Hyundai came, right, with the Brazilian market booming at that time, during the Lula years, you know, the commodities boom. And so when a bunch of automakers came and invested heavily here, Hyundai couldn't produce its own cars. They had to develop a project that wouldn't conflict with Kiowa, right? That's where the HB20 and the Creta come from, and they spent years and years trying to renegotiate that contract. And finally now, right, what was it? Last year, for example, we started to have unified dealerships. You go to a Hyundai dealership and you have the imported high-value products, which used to be KO's exclusivity, along with the national products. Manufactured by HMB, right, by Hyundai Motor Brazil. We had two parallel networks. It was crazy, right? And the consumer had to figure it out on their own. The websites were different too. Yeah, an honorable mention in the category of not reading the fine print in contracts, right? Because this Hyundai Brazil factory, HMB and Piracicaba, ended up being Hyundai's and not Kia's, even though Kia was a brand that had a series of big hits here in Brazil with imports like the Kia Soul. It had more brand equity here in Brazil than Hyundai. But the now defunct Asia Motors has a tax issue with the Brazilian government, and the Brazilian government considers Kia to be the legal successor of Asia Motors. And the only way for Kia to benefit from the plans, right, from Inovar Auto at the time in Brazil and all the others, today it would mean settling this debt under the Mover program. That's why Hyundai in Brazil today is almost entirely, well, it's already entirely under the umbrella of the parent company, which is called Hyundai Kia. It's worth remembering, while Kia still has a distributor, the Gandini Group, a contract, right, with an independent importer, which has restricted volumes precisely because they can't manufacture in Brazil, right? And this ends up really limiting Kia's competitiveness in Brazil. So, two cases here of Koreans who didn't spend, high-ranking Korean executives who didn't spend much time with the legal department when reviewing contracts for the Brazilian market about 30 years ago, let's say. All of this happened in the 90s. Number 8, Peugeot and Citroën after-sales service, right? And we can also add here the lack of proper adaptation to local conditions for some Peugeot Citroën cars, which ended up causing significant brand damage for both here in Brazil, right? Things that happened many years ago and to this day are still circulating in the Brazilian automotive internet, generating jokes about a certain intellectual laziness. I'll add another asterisk there as well, and we already know that, right? We talked about the difficulties that this major downturn in the Brazilian market had in the mid-20 teens, the difficulties it created for Renault, for Ford, for Chevrolet, also created for Peugeot and Citroën, which should have had an investment cycle there in the 2000s and 2010s, but that never happened. And the most classic case is the Brazilian 207, which was actually made as a 206 plus, and if the car had been called 206 plus, everything would have been fine. But the subsidiary here in Brazil decided to call it 207. And then the contrast with the European product, which was a true 207, a new generation, became very big as well. That caused a lot of damage to the brand's image. But I think that mainly this after-sales issue, there were missing parts and the service wasn't good. Adapting to local conditions includes issues like a fragile suspension arm. It's that old story, right? When you earn the consumer's trust, it takes many decades. But to lose that trust, all it takes is one generation of mistakes, one product line, one generation of automotive products, which usually lasts 4 or 5 years, just one mistake, and you'll need decades again to recover. And I think today Peugeot and Citroën have already largely moved past this, but for the most part, right, because of the whole Stellantis process, right, today using drivetrains, powertrains, many Fiat powertrains, that also helps with the growth and recovery of trust, the reliability of these products in the national market. I spoke well of Fiat, right? About how Fiat mechanicals, the reliability of Fiat mechanicals, brought credibility back to the core products of Peugeot and Citroën. Let's say something bad about Fiat, which actually would be a warning for all of them. But Fiat was the one who invested the most and insisted the most on those horrible, impractical, completely useless automated transmissions, right? In Fiat's case, it was the Dualogic, which spread throughout the whole lineup. But everyone did that, right? Volkswagen had the iMotion, Chevrolet had the EasyTronic. Each one had their own. They came up with their own little names, but in all of them, they were just a big piece of junk. The first time I saw one of their automated cars, I said, my God, this is really bad. No one is going to enjoy driving this. Maybe some people will drive it out of necessity or ignorance. There was even a way for you to suffer a little less with the jerks and the slowness of this type of transmission, which was to take your foot off the accelerator each time at every gear change, right? And then just let the clutch do the work, the automated clutch, without having to cut the acceleration. So instead of being if you made a gear change in these cars with your foot all the way down, it was like this. there were two jerks. If you took your foot off, you would do, it was one jerk. It was a big jerk, but it was just one jerk. You could reduce the jerk. But then if you have to do that with the pedal, man, isn't it better to just press another pedal and move your hand? And let's keep going, right? It was one of those things, you pictured yourself there. And even today, right? I remember there was a funk song. I'm poor. My car has a manual transmission. You have to shift gears. Not having to change gears in traffic became something aspirational, a status symbol, right? Everybody wanted it. But it's something very expensive for the reality of the Brazilian market at that time. Mass marketing torque converter automatics in entry-level cars. So automated manuals were what they ended up with. Because actually what we see today, right? The better solution would have been the CVT. The CVT is the automatic transmission that's cheap to make, but with a naturally aspirated engine, it also gives a very bad experience. Nissan was a pioneer in this and still continues today, right? With those naturally aspirated engines, CVT, it's terrible. But what saves the CVT is downsizing, right? The CVT with a turbo engine becomes something actually quite acceptable and very efficient for daily use. And now there are plenty of 1-liter turbo engines from Stellantis with CVTs out there doing the job that Fiat tried to do with the Dualogic, which was also really bad, and put the brand's reputation out there to get a lot of hate. Back then, mostly in magazines, but also in the early days of the Brazilian automotive internet. And the 10th and last biggest mistake is the most recent of all, right? And this is also a broad rebuke for the entire domestic industry, right? I even recommend the Caro Cortez episode, our podcast with Milad Kalume, where we talk a lot about this. It's like, even with government incentive policies, even with everyone being able to see what was happening in China, the major traditional brands here, known as the national industry, are actually multinationals. But the more traditional multinationals, the ones that have been operating here in Brazil for much longer, took a long time to move towards electrification, right? And then the Chinese companies came in and just swam laps around them. And today we have BYD and GWM in the top 10 for market share in Brazil. Right now, as we're recording this video, now that February has ended, the Dolphin Mini was, for the first time in history, the best-selling retail car in Brazil for a month, right? It could have been a product from any of the traditional brands. We know, right? Competing with the Chinese, with their scale, with the working conditions in China, etc., etc., it's impossible. But for example, the mild hybrid that Stellantis developed for the Pulse, Fastback, and the 2008 model, that could have come much earlier, right? And been offered to the consumer who was used to buying the traditional brands here and trusts the traditional brands here more. Benefits include exemption from driving restrictions and lower vehicle taxes in many states. All the traditional companies that manufacture in large volumes in Brazil took a long time to move towards electrification, and they're paying the price today in market share loss to the Chinese companies. So what did you think of this list? Tell us in the comments which mistakes of the Brazilian automotive industry you think we're missing here. If you mention plastic dashboards, I'll just say, you don't know anything about the Brazilian automotive industry. You need to study a bit before commenting here. Leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. Who knows, maybe you can list your own 10 mistakes besides the 10 I've already mentioned here. Do you think you can find another 10? Also, don't forget to watch the first video in this series, From Quebrada to Doug DeMuro, the 10 most transformative cars in the Brazilian automotive industry in the last 30 years. Leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel. Thanks a lot, take care, and a big hug.